I am actually the surrogate here for our executive chair, Katina Michael, who is online, and she has a comment here that she wanted me to read. Fancy bots taking over in some positive way to help humans. That's a great home for human-robot interaction, even if robots are soft in form. So once again, thank you, Darren. Okay. Picking up with our next presentation, which is called Technologies Around Lesser Known Privacy Risks in Social Media. It's probably no accident that the last name of this individual is the same as mine. I want to say that I'm very grateful that we have at least one person of the many that we extended the invitation to who actually runs social media companies to come talk to us. I have a feeling that many of them perhaps thought that they were under fire. But in any case, I'm very pleased that I was able to convince my son to join me and maybe for dinner tonight, you know, whatever. So Sam Lipoff is the Chief Technology Officer at Polar. He's based at their headquarters in Nashville and was in town on the West Coast for an NFT conference and then kind enough to stop by here. Sam was an undergrad student at Harvard in chemical physics and history of science, a master of philosophy student at Trinity College, Cambridge in history and philosophy of science, a PhD student at MIT in computational physical chemistry. He's a co-founder of a number of companies, Boston native. He's lived in the UK, mainland China, Singapore, speaks Mandarin Chinese, and when he's not otherwise busy, he reads ancient Greek. Grateful Samuel will be speaking to us about some privacy risks from the point of view of an operator of a social media company.
Thank you. And there's a clicker here, yeah. So I don't know whether it's a good or bad sign that my dad had to read the bio as opposed to just knowing it, but something. Excuse me. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful. I'm very excited to be able to talk to you today. I actually didn't know there was going to be a bio introduction, so I'm gonna skip through a bunch of slides. Well, maybe just to say one thing that my first company was actually a big data company in 2004. It was funded by Y Combinator, and I have to admit at that time, I don't think we had a single conversation about digital privacy. Just not at all. I mean, also was never actually released as a product. It failed that summer, but it just wasn't even on the radar at all 15, 18 years ago. So too, when I was an AI engineer at Tasted Menu, which was a real product, I don't remember any conversation about digital privacy. And this was maybe 15 years ago, 12 years ago. I think it's an important historical thing to think about how this field has now become, every company definitely thinks about these things. Certainly in some of my later companies, we did think about privacy in various ways, had to deal with GDPR and other regulations. But now I'm the CTO of Parler, which is a free speech and data privacy focused social media company. And here, digital privacy, data privacy is core to basically every decision that's made. And so it's a very interesting shift for me personally, and I think it mirrors a larger shift in the industry. But before I go on to talk, I'm just curious in the room, and this is obviously not a representative sample of social media users. It's highly engineer and data privacy focused here. But when you think of digital privacy, what comes to mind first? Darren. Is my data safe? Great. Yeah, no, absolutely. What else do you think about when we think of digital privacy? Yes. Who knows what I'm doing? Yes. Respected. Am I respected as a user? That's very interesting. So I think these are all great, and we're actually going to talk about all those. I think if you poll a general audience of social media users, the first thing they will say is it's about ads, it's about targeted ads, it's about being followed on different sites. There's a sort of icky factor. I heard one of the speakers in the morning news, I think the guy from Google, said, oh, is this past the icky test? I would just say, and I think I'm preaching to the choir here, that digital privacy is not just about ads. And I think there are very misleading views that are, I will call them propaganda by certain big tech companies that are trying to focus the lens of digital privacy on just ads, when in fact there are many other dimensions to digital privacy that are often overlooked. I will say though, and there's this concept in economics called repugnance, that many economists would say, well, if there's a problem with not enough kidneys in a market, just let people buy a kidney. But somehow people don't like that. There's an ickiness to it. It's repugnant. And market design economists like Nobel laureate Al Roth figured out ways in which you can do kidney exchanges. My kidney may not match my father's, but maybe someone else does, and I give my kidney to that person, they give the kidney. It's ways to sort of design around repugnance. And I feel like as engineers, in the same way that the market design engineers have to deal with, that it's repugnant to say, purchase college admission spots. How do you deal with that? We may have to also recognize that despite our best intentions, users are going to find some things icky. And there's no way of designing around it other than to just not do it. And so that's a constraint as engineers we may have to think about sometimes. But let me go on to describe some what I would say are generally lesser thought of problems, maybe not by this room, but by sort of the ordinary consumer and how we should think about them. A big one is security, right? Is my data safe? And this is a big part about privacy, because if you're entrusting your data to a third party, how do you know that it's safe? Verification, that is to say, how do you know that who you're talking to is actually who they say they are, right? That they're actually a user and not a bot, for example, or that you see there's not maybe a binary distinction between a person and a bot, right? There may be a person has used a bot in generating content, for example. How do we think about that? Is spam a kind of data privacy, digital privacy? I think many people say yes, that if you're wish to see certain types of content, but you're constantly getting other types of content that you are unwanted, that's a form of digital privacy. There's also a kind of algorithmic manipulation. How do you know that what you're seeing, you're not part of, Meta doing some experiment on you? And is that all right? I mean, do they need to have consent? Or, is everything a kind of experiment? And I think there's a lot of deep questions here that are not obvious. How do you know that somebody in the company is not being a bad actor and is, trying to look you up, that they're not stalking you, that they're not, maybe even very instantly, they're trying to, diagnose a bug and they're looking into a user data? What are the controls inside a company about internal peaking, and how do you think about that? Information compositing, right? That individual pieces of information may not pose a privacy risk. But if you can composite all of these things together, does it actually yield to a kind of ick factor that, oh, I didn't realize that you could figure out all these things about me just by, even reading the public posts that I have. And just to give one example, you can look in Facebook and you can see what Facebook thinks your interests are. Now, usually this makes me feel better because they're often hilariously wrong, right? So the AI is not good enough yet. But if the AI were to get really, really good, would we find that has violated our privacy, even though every individual piece of information we give by itself, seems fine? Is there a kind of digital redlining going on? So there are examples where certain types of advertising can be limited to people with certain demographic profiles. And does this violate people's privacy or rights in certain ways, that if you only give real estate listings to people who've expressed certain interests or certain demographics or certain age, or people who maybe vote in certain ways, is that a kind of redlining? And is that information okay in some contexts? I mean, it's reasonable to only give advertisements for barbershops to men and to women's clothing to women, but is it not okay when it goes into other contexts, and how do we decide those things? What about deep packet inspection? You know, if you think that your information is only being seen by the social media provider, what if it's being inspected along the way by governments or by other actors? And what happens if the social media provider is using various third-party tools? You know, almost everyone uses Google Analytics. Parler doesn't, actually. But we use another tool, but how do you know that that tool is respecting you know, the same privacy rights that you signed an agreement for? And what happens when, you know, you're using free tools where, you know, generally the idea is, we have this saying in our company, it's very commonly used, that if you're not paying for it, you know, you are the product, right? So if you're using a free tool like even Bitly, a very simple link sharer, you know, that is in fact sharing a lot of data. It may not be in extremely nefarious ways, but are you aware of it? And of course, I think an earlier speaker said something like, just because there's a 1,000-page, you know, ULA that nobody reads, and it may be there, and may be written by lawyers and maybe for lawyers, is it really something that is actually real, like informed consent? And is that really what you actually want? And similarly, not everybody updates their privacy policies to actually reflect what's going on. And you know, there may be actual bad actors, but in my experience, generally this is not on purpose. This is because something has gone ahead of the privacy policy, or vice versa. What happens when you have a social media site that allows HTML embeds? So for example, playing YouTube videos through a player on the site. How does the privacy policy interact with that, right? Because then you have a little bit of JavaScript that can go on in there. And this is, I think, Darren, you were just saying that you built an early social media search engine. It's very not obvious to many people when you post something on social media, even if it's public, how discoverable is it? And that can change dramatically over time. It might not be discoverable at the moment that you post it, but that site may change its robots.txt, or other search engines may or may not respect that over time, or it may get copied by third parties. So there are many, for example, Instagram posts are not searchable directly in Google, but there are many third parties that scrape Instagram, and their sites are searchable in Google, which is very interesting. What happens when you have, or you think you have, pseudo-anonymity, but that's broken in some way? So there was a big controversy about a month ago where a Washington Post reporter, through very dogged reporting, figured out the woman behind the Libs of TikTok account, right? And this person thought that they were pseudonymous, right? But through very small errors over a very long period of time, an extremely persistent reporter was able to figure out this person's real identity. You have a question, Darren? Yeah? Yeah, please, please.
I just want to say something kind of creepy, but it's true. I have a service that I do not let out, but provided I have a username of any, famous social networks, I can get, I can, by a 30% hit rate, can get their email address. If I can build it, right, others can. So on your point, you know, this is a very accessible content. They just have to pay the services to get it.
Yeah, and I would say too that often there may be very strong pseudonymity in a single site, but it's all like about the weakest link. So if you use the same username or the same profile picture on another site, someone can figure out, this Twitter account belongs to this same person's LinkedIn account, and then it's all over. And then there's a question about, do most users of social media know what government can legally obtain? I considered myself an expert social media user. Maybe I left out of my bio that as a senior at Harvard, I joined Facebook on the 3rd day. I'm user number 805 of Facebook, so I've been using Facebook longer than anyone here, I guarantee you. But I did not realize until joining Parler how often the US government files subpoena requests for metadata, and how often there were warrants for all the data. And I guarantee you this is not something unique to Parler. Facebook, Twitter get, probably 1,000 times the volume that we do. And that's only what governments legally obtain. Maybe I didn't put this in here, but, or I think it's next. You know, what governments can illegally obtain. Oh, let me just say, so the third-party doctrine is the idea that, you know, if I'm holding my own data, you know, the government needs a warrant to get it from me. If someone else is holding my data, the government may just ask, and they just give it to them. There's a question, yes? Here, let me come over with the microphone so we can get it recorded too. Questions are great, by the way. It's good to be interactive.
Just pointing out that the U.S. is a bit of an outlier on some of these legal questions, like the third-party doctrine or reasonable expectations of privacy, which is very binary and pretty weird for the rest of the world, the way that the U.S. Legal decisions have come down on those issues.
Yeah, that might be, although there are 1 billion people in China who are under even more strict legal doctrine. I lived in Singapore for 7 years, which you know, is quite free country, but also has a lot of government power to be able to inspect social media, and the social media giants have all acquiesced there as well. Is there another question there? Yeah.
Even countries like India, where democracy seems to exist, now it is no longer true. The government can access anything it wants, including its own program, which is called Aadhaar Card, which contains all the information of the people, is readily available for anybody.
So, okay, we've talked about a lot of problems. Let me go over a couple possible solutions, and then finally I'll go over some tensions that I think remain even with some technical solutions. But let me say that just disclosing what you're doing in a privacy policy is not the answer. It may be a good thing to do, but it is not like a magic panacea that makes all problems really go away. It may reduce, Darren, your legal liability for certain things, but it doesn't make the actual problem go away. Earlier, I think someone was calling for federal law. I'm not sure that all regulation is bad, but I will guarantee you that regulation is not the answer. And especially from the perspective of a relatively small social media company. We're very scared of large amounts of regulation because only the giants are able to comply with, you know, extreme regulatory measures. It's already quite confusing that there's a California policy, there's a Europe policy, there are policies in certain countries, but more regulation is not going to magically make the problem disappear. It is going to entrench the incumbents. Will simply moving social media to a paid business model be the answer? Well, no, it is not the answer for a couple of reasons. One is that users don't actually want it, right? I mean, all the social media giants that have tried subscription services get a very, very small fraction of users to pay. People generally don't mind being served ads in certain contexts, but merely getting rid of ads, as I showed, does not magically reduce all the privacy problems. So I would say that in general, there's some combination between new technologies and organizational commitment can actually ameliorate, not solve, but ameliorate many of these problems. So, for example, the move, which has been general to HTTPS instead of HTTP, has not eliminated deep packet inspection, but has made it much more difficult and has solved, I would say, a number of man-in-the-middle type attacks. And having good practices and always using this, not allowing, say, HTTP fallback, is one good privacy policy that I don't see even everyone implementing yet, despite the technology being there, and it's almost trivial. End-to-end encryption is being commonly used more and more for direct messaging. It's even found now in, say, Microsoft Teams for internal corporate direct messaging. It is not typically used for communication between an individual and a social media site, even if, say, you have a private account, right? An account that, you know, can only be seen by people who you vetted, right? And so it's kind of interesting to me that even this technology, which is now relatively easy to implement, there's lots of libraries for it, is not widely used. Other than in direct messaging, where it is become a sort of de facto industry standard. I say with franking here to allow people to, report abusive content or other things in a way that doesn't violate the privacy. There are solutions to this, but yet somehow this is relatively easy, but also not relatively used. Another thing is creating individual UUIDs instead of using a username or a general UID that you share with somebody. And so I'll tell a quick story within Parler. We started using, we didn't want to use Google Analytics for a variety of reasons, but we use a paid service called Clicky and another free service called Matomo. And both very privacy respecting user analytics tools. But when we originally designed it, we weren't really thinking about privacy in the very beginning. We just used the user ID and we shared that with Matomo to be able to, answer questions like how many daily active users we have. Somebody on our team who is very, very privacy conscious pointed out, why are we sharing a UID with a third party? Why not make a unique user ID just for that third party, and we're the only ones who have the master concordance table? And that was like an obvious thing to do. It was not any more difficult, really, than sending the UID, but it wasn't my first thought. And I'm glad that he's on our team, and he points out, he's the privacy gadfly who points out something like this. And Facebook did not initially do this. They now do this. They share with advertisers, for example, an advertiser or app-specific UUID, and it's generally good practice. In general, segregating data so that it's sort of on a need-to-know basis, right? You sort of ask, does this person need to know? Does this app need to know? Does this third party need to know or not? Earlier, there was pointing out, keeping all your software up to date. I think, I'm not a SecOps person, but there's a little bit of unease in the SecOps community. Sometimes, does the new version actually introduce more vulnerabilities or not? I'll leave it to the SecOps people, but I generally try to tell my people, let's relatively quickly make sure everything is up to date. Otherwise, you might end up with one server somewhere that has, been unpatched for, years. Thinking very carefully as a social media provider, what do you actually want to store? And do you want to store, for example, users' IP address? And I'll talk in a moment about some tensions where you want to prevent bots, for example. And knowing a user's IP address is very useful to detect, inauthentic activity coming from bots. But how long do you really need to store that for? Maybe storing it for 36 hours is long enough and getting rid of excess data so that no government can even request it because you don't store it anymore. Or if there's a breach, it won't be let out because you don't store it anymore. Thinking always about pruning data, user data, to make sure that you're actually only storing what you actually need to store. This is what I was saying before about needing to know, needing to store. I really like this kind of, they call it a BCG matrix, a 2x2 matrix. And I like to think about all third-party tools that we use on this matrix in various ways. That, what are third-party tools that are business critical versus sort of optional? What are third-party tools that we could self-host as opposed to using a paid third-party tool? And I would say that the last 10 years have seen an explosion of SaaS packages that do really wonderful things. There's a privacy trade-off to all of that. And what we've been doing at Parler is not eliminating third-party tools, but we've been asking, by putting them on a matrix like this, asking if it's business critical, but there's a critical privacy component to it, can we self-host instead of using a paid third-party tool? It's a little bit more work. It may not make economic sense, actually, because you need then DevOps engineers and others working on it, but it actually has a real privacy benefit. And I would suggest that there are more and more open source packages these days that I think this trend of using third-party SaaS tools for sort of ordinary functions like data analytics is going to be reversed a bit, where you'll see more and more people self-hosting open source tools. Is there a question there or a comment? Yeah.
Thanks very much. But on the open source self tools and what you said earlier about patching, problems with open source libraries if they've got a small or individual maintainer and they go off the rails, like that one that did that JavaScript library that bricked everyone using his tool in a .ru domain. Understand the motivation. I don't think it was a good move, but should they have that kind of capability? And if you're using open source and you're patching, are you opening yourself up?
Yeah, I would actually say that there's less of a danger of that if you're self-hosting a tool than if you're using a third-party tool. Because a third-party tool you're paying, and if they want to brick all the RU domains on it, they can. If it's a self-hosted tool, you can decide not to put that patch in, or you can comment out that part of the patch. And so I think there is a tension between generally letting someone else who's a professional worry about, the security of that tool versus taking it on yourself. But I think more and more as there's widely adopted packages, we're going to actually see a move back from perhaps the over-reliance in SaaS tools. One of the reasons why I went through my bio a little bit in the beginning is to also say in my first company, we built everything ourselves. That was 2004. Nobody used third-party SaaS tools in that way. After a stint back in academia, when I came to start a startup 7 years ago, the world had changed. And now startup was more about patching together building blocks of SaaS tools. And I'm beginning to see a move back from that a little bit. I think there'll still be SaaS tools, but I think there'll be more and more self-hosted open source tools. Brings its own set of problems. But I think ultimately we'll find a better medium when taking into account digital privacy. One of the tools that helps with this is to containerize your own setup. And so we've been moving everything onto Kubernetes. And it's made it possible in a way to not have to have a fleet of DevOps engineers to maintain those open source packages, but to sort of have what I call like a SaaS tool within our own organization. So tools like this, having Ansible playbooks that can sort of run deployments automatically without having to necessarily use third-party tools. And I'll say, Parler is completely self-hosted. We don't use a public cloud. If you know about the history of AWS deplatforming us, there's an obvious reason why. Earlier, somebody made a comment that social media platforms use public clouds. That's not generally true. The very large ones, Facebook, Twitter, they're all on-premises hosted. Reddit was an AWS shop, but they're moving to a hybrid model as well. So it is not the case that the big giants are always on premises. Someone with 15 million users like me would generally still be on a public cloud if there wasn't an external reason not to. But I think it's actually good for our privacy protection to not be on a public cloud. And I think you'll see more and more as tools like this make it easier, you'll see more and more smaller social media platforms choosing to self-host. I've got 2 minutes left, so let me run through a couple tensions and maybe we have a little bit of time for a question or two. I ran through this example that there's a sort of privacy problem with IP tracking, but also if you care about spam and verification, authenticity, you'll want to do that and you have to find a happy medium. Another example is that for a long time, Parler required both a phone number and an email address for all users. Almost no social media does that. And I joke, although I think it's probably true, the main reason that most social media does not require that is that they don't mind if there are lots of bots that inflate their monthly active user counts. The other hand, there is a privacy trade-off on both sides. If you don't require phone numbers, you end up with a lot of bots. If you do require phone numbers and the government gives you a warrant, you have to give the phone number of that user. And some users don't want to join a service that they need to give a phone number for. So are there all alternatives to this? Giving the phone number to a third-party service and letting them verify, for example. How aggressive should your spam filtering be? What if you catch lots of authentic content in your spam filtering? And in general, in startups especially, there's a need for speed. And having too many lawyers in the company makes a department of telling people no. And I would say to the privacy people or the lawyers out there, do not be the department of telling people no. Because what will happen is that eventually either business requirements or engineers will just override you. But if you can be very cooperative and figure out solutions that make business sense and can proceed at the speed of a startup, it's very possible to have a very privacy-conscious startup. Finally, I would just say that to me, targeted ads, to come back to this, are an example where this is the one that users really care about. And are there ways to both provide business value and the service that users want without that ick factor? So let me just say, if there's any questions, either now or you're happy to email me. Thank you so much.
You mentioned the speed. I mean, as a social media company, you have no control about the speed unless you ask for it. You mean the speed of transferring data or the speed of?
I should be more clear. By speed, I mean that for a startup, the speed of development, speed of product development is everything. And so being able to build things very quickly, to not be bogged down in lots of regulations, to not have the policy department say, oh my God, you can't do that, is very important. Figuring out, though, at the same time, there's a tension, because if you want to really care about data privacy, you have to involve those conversations. So figuring out a way that the policy people can work at the speed of a startup is very important. I think it's very different, the sort of data privacy practices that an early stage startup needs to think about versus a corporate behemoth. Not that one should be more privacy conscious than the other, but the ways of working that the policy people need to do is a little bit different in order to, if you don't have a business, you don't have a business. This is the last question.
Yeah. Well, I'll be quick. So Parler is actually the closest to the ideal format of the social media in my mind. So I would like to welcome you to consider if you can lead a standards project in IEEE addressing something like a recommended practice for free speech enabling social media.
Well, I'd be happy to be involved in some way. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sam. I'll take advantage of having the microphone to make just a couple closing comments before introducing the next speaker. Question came up about what government might do and should do and allowed to do. Technology is moving so rapidly that kind of the things that we think about of what we used to call wiretapping or privacy or this sort of thing, it changed when all of a sudden the information is going in digital form along with metadata. So I recall there was a testimony given by an admiral in charge of the NSA in front of Congress, and the question was asked, are you listening to people's phone calls? Are you spying on people? And he said, no. And then later on, it was discovered that, in fact, they were collecting 100% of the metadata. They weren't actually listening to what you're saying, but they knew your originating phone number, your terminating phone number, how long you're on the line, and this sort of thing. And they're not supposed to be doing anything within the confines of the United States unless the call is originated across the border, this sort of thing. So whether he lied or he was just, dealing with kind of a Bill Clinton version of whatever a lie is, I don't know. And I'll mention one other thing at the potentially embarrassing my son, I'm sorry. When he was a high school student and attending high school at Boston University, he had a website, and he was very proud of posting his photos of himself, which included like his library card, his driver's license, and this sort of thing. And about a year later, we ended up getting a traffic ticket from Australia where he had never been, and apparently somebody counterfeited his, do you remember this? You did, yeah. They counterfeit, they took the format. So this was kind of at the dawn of the internet in the 90s, so I think we've all learned a little better. Anyhow, we actually are back on time again. Could we put the next transition slide up? There we